Hello, everyone. I am Suzanne Lenon, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Women and Gender Studies. I will be moderating today's event. Thank you for joining us. Mia and I are really excited to present this season of Women Scholar Speaker Series that focuses on transdisciplinary perspectives on death, dying, and grief. We had such a great turnout and response to our first event with Rebecca Many Grey Horses and Dr. Jennifer Otto. So we're excited that you're here.
Yes, welcome everyone. As Suzanne said, I'm Mia van Leeuwen, Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Fine Arts and Co-Chair of the Women Scholar Speaker Series. I just wanted to mention that before we begin today's presentation, our next event on January 25th, we are thrilled to be hosting Joanna Ebenstein, the Creative Director of Morbid Anatomy, who'll be presenting a talk called Death in the Age of Rationality, Playing with Death in Popular Amusement. This talk will examine Western cultural imaginings of death in a post-religious world by tracing the history of death-themed popular amusements from the phantasmagoria ghost shows of the 18th century France to the present, including a look at the Paris Morgue, the Grand Guignol Theatre, and Coney Island's disaster spectacles. I'll be moderating this event and hope you can join us. Also, this afternoon's webinar is being recorded. There'll be a Q&A period following today's presentation, which runs about 30 minutes. Questions, please enter your questions in the QA function, which you will find at the...
Thanks, Mia. I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Is a lecturer in gender studies at Karlstad University in Sweden. Her research interests are on matters of death and dying, gender, health, and technology, as well as feminist technoscience studies. Her dissertation, Making Death Matter, was an exploration of processes and practices through which death is materialized and becomes meaningful in the context of Alzheimer's science, and how different bodies become killable differently in the science economy of the lab and are exposed as waste. Her postdoc research at Turku University in Finland in 2018 further explored death and waste management practices in the lab, so to contribute to theorizing nature, life, and death as interconnected and in terms of queer ecologies of death. Dr. Mehrabi is one of the founding members of the Queer Death Studies Network and a member of the Posthumanities Hub in Sweden. Her current research focuses on questions of accessibility and equality in times of digitalization of healthcare in Sweden from a feminist, new materialist perspective. Her talk today is called Queer Ecologies of Death in a Lab. Welcome, Dr. Mehrabi.
Yes. Thank you so much for inviting me, Suzanne, Mia, and Jamie for making this possible for me to give this talk actually on my recent article, Queer Ecologies of Death in the Lab. I have a PowerPoint which I wish to share so that it would be less boring. And here we go. Do you see what I see? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we do. Looks good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So, and I cannot move this. Oh, now here we go. Great. So the paper is based on my PhD fieldwork in a fruit fly laboratory in a biochemistry department at one of the universities in Sweden, where I spent about a year doing a field work and also working simultaneously as a technician in this lab, despite of my prior lack of knowledge in the field of biochemistry of Alzheimer's or laboratory work. So it was pretty much for me like trial and error, learning through experience, and at points series of unfortunate events, but overall it worked. And even though I moved around the department, sort of visiting other laboratories that are working with Alzheimer's, using other kinds of animal models and organisms, range from cell model to mouse model to brain matter and etc. Majority of my time during this 1 year was in this very tiny, small fruit fly lab, which was pretty much 2 rooms, and you can see through the picture, actually through the mirror, that's the other room. So it was really, really tiny. And I had the pleasure to get to know 4 female scientists who were working in this lab with the flies on biochemistry of Alzheimer's disease. And of course, they had many tales about gender matters at the work environment, but that's another story. So during my PhD time, and as I was trying to find that burning question and what my contribution would be to the field of feminist techno-science studies, I kind of got stuck with death. As I learned more about fruit flies and their role in natural sciences, and as I worked with them, kind of death became so evident to the point that, I had to work with it. I had to get to know it. And as it was old news to many within the field of biochemistry, but very fresh news to me, these flies are one of the most common and killable bodies that are used in natural sciences. Yet they are rarely discussed within laboratory ethical guidelines or within humanities and social sciences, at least at the time when I did my PhD. So I decided to write about death in the lab, how neural death and dying is understood and brought to life in the laboratory using the killable bodies of fruit flies. What are the material discursive entanglements that make fruit flies such killable animals or organisms, or within the laboratory's spectrum of killability? How can we ethically respond to these deaths, particularly that fruit flies are not very cuddly or particularly likable, but to the contrary, flies are often deemed as vermin to be exterminated? And what happens once these bodies are consumed by science and are disposed of as biowaste? So I wrote my PhD exploring these questions, and 3 years later, and even though I promised to myself at my defense that I will never ever go back to flies, and I've had enough of them, I realized that I want to push my discussion on death in fruit flies a little bit further and rethink parts of it in terms of queer ecologies of death, and hence the article that I'm presenting today. I have to mention that this article was also part of a special issue on a queer that studies death, dying, and mourning from a queer feminist perspective, with a collective of brilliant scholars that I had the pleasure to work with during this. So if you're interested, you can explore it. And of course, it's also part of the Curated Studies Network publication series, among the other ones that I have here on my PowerPoint slide. That I've been working with Dr. Maria Radomska and Professor Nina Like. So to go back to my dissertation. In my dissertation, I write partially about how fruit flies' bodies, living, dying, or dead, are enacted as waste in the lab. What I do in this article is to explore such enactments in relation to the notion of purity and normative understanding of nature as pure from a queer feminist perspective. In other words, I wish to discuss how an understanding of nature as pure and detached from the laboratory space shapes the space of the lab and practices of handling flies, living, dying, and dead as biological waste. Of course, such critical discussion on notions of nature and purity has been done within ecofeminism, queer trans studies, decolonial, post-colonial studies, technoscience and humanities, critically reflect on the modernist understanding of nature as pure, that is shaped by androcentrism, Eurocentrism, white supremacy, heterosis normativity, and more. Studies that expose and analyze the fragility of the notion of nature, as well as purity and the effective power of matter out of place to dismantle the order of things that are built around such nostalgias of purity. In fact, within the modernist understanding of purity, matter out of place is a side of anxiety and disorder and has to be corrected, policed, and in some cases even exterminated through the direct violence or indirect violence that is often justified through discourses of pesthood and othering. So I wish to contribute to this discussion and on the matters that are connected to violence, purity, and pesthood. And in this article, particularly through death and dead matter within the context of bio-waste management in the laboratory. The reason I find bio-waste an interesting figuration for feminist discussion is that modes of handling bio-waste in the lab, in the way that I experience it, which is defined in terms of dead animals or dismembered body parts of often transgenic and infected humanized model organisms, is embedded in similar security and control activities and anxieties, because bio-waste is matter out of place. This is an interesting twist because the composing organic matter is often assumed to be an energy resource, food for other living beings and part of the natural life cycle. However, once biological matter is infected, it becomes matter out of place. Altered by technoscientific and chemical means, bio-waste become ambiguous. It exits the natural cycle of decomposition and becomes an object of radical regulation, policing, and elimination. Whether through strict guidelines, mosquito nets that were all over the lab, or sort of like the very simple act of keeping the laboratory door closed at all time. Modes of handling waste in the lab are to protect nature from being infected by biological and chemical hazards that are produced in the lab. In this context, dead matter is agential. It fosters life, for example, bacteria, and as such, it blurs the socially constructed boundary between life and death. In other words, thinking with living, dying, and dead bodies of fruit flies as laboratory waste queers the binary understanding of life and death, purity and danger, natural and artificial, nature and laboratory environments in favor of ecology. Meaning that it brings attention to the web of relationships and interconnections as the ontological unit of analysis, always already technologically mediated, socioculturally constructed, interspecies, and in my case, embedded in death. So the concept of ecology is often used in sciences to explore the relations among organisms and between organisms and their material surroundings. Reading the concept through the lens of queer theory not only focuses on the material relationalities common in sciences, but also examines the socio-political aspects through which ecologies are made. As such, queer ecology accounts for diversity, interdependence, and justice on the one hand, and bodies that, and I'm quoting literal here, have been exploited, dumped on, and contaminated with toxic emissions, end of quote, disproportionately. I use the concept of queer ecology, drawing on scholars such as Morton, Melchen, Sandilands, and I don't have here, maybe you can see. Sandilands' work and also Marietta Radomska, among others, to analyze practices through which notions and materialities of nature, waste, life, and death, and their entanglements are reimagined through the lens of queer theories. In other words, queer ecology aims to undo naturalized link between a pure nature, life, and heterosexual reproduction in favor of the abject, waste, decomposition, and death by asking what forms of life and death, forms of life and death come alive in a queer ecology in which reproduction is not about production of the same, but a potentiality of what could be. As such, in defining the term queer ecology, I take my point of departure in relational becoming of life and death, nature and waste, environment and the laboratory space that are enacted through improper affiliations or improper intimacies, to work with Melchen's work on animacies. According to Chen, one can think of queer, and I'm quoting here, in terms of the social and cultural formations of improper affiliation, so that queerness might well describe any array of subjectivities, intimacies, beings, and spaces located outside of heteronormative, end of quote. So I believe the concept of improper affiliation captures the sexual politics of the laboratory and waste management practices, because it is not limited to sexuality itself and can potentially include different ways of togetherness. So what do I mean by queer ecologies of death? I'm going to read you sort of a field note that I had. The smell, rotting food and rotting flies. There are dead flies at the bottom of the tube, half buried in the gooey food. The larvae are moving on top of them or on the sides of the tube. As the larvae dive deep into and out of the food, I can see them, the moving black dots, with my naked eyes. There are also alive flies that are stuck in the food. I can see them moving their wings and their legs, struggling to get out of the food. Those I have to push deep down into the food and bury them alive. And as I do it, I can feel the decaying texture of the food. I feel the gooiness even through the brush. I have to look close to see if the fly is properly buried. The sour smell of decomposing matter rushes into my nose. As I get close to the tube, I gag. I take the next tube. I turn the tube to empty it of flies, and the gooey food starts running down the tube and takes over some of the flies, covering them with the rotting food. The texture of the food, once solid, is now semi-fluid. It tells me that the food is no longer nutritious and healthy for the flies, and that the flies might have been contaminated by mites and unwelcome bacteria. I have to throw the tube out in the waste, no matter how many larvae, pupae, and flies are still in there alive. So this note was taken in one of my informants, during one of my informant's experiments, Helene's, and in her lab. So in Helene's lab, biological waste management protocols require the technician to separate dead bodies or body parts from the rest of the laboratory tools, such as tubes. The technician then had to put these separate entities in different plastic bags and autoclave them immediately after the experiment. In the tube, food, bacteria, flies, and their remains mix with one another, which makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to draw a clear-cut boundary between these biological entities, transgenic and non-transgenic, as well as alive and dead. The tube embodies a queer ecology of death in which biological waste is not simply a dead specimen or body parts, as it is indicated in the laboratory guidelines. Biological waste becomes an ambiguous category consisting of simultaneously living and dying, alive and dead organisms. Such a queer ecology of death as a multi-species non/living, to borrow Radomska's terminology, as a multi-species non/living mix, evades laboratory waste protocols and waste management. Cultural geographer Sebastian Abramson and environmental anthropologist Filippo Bertoni argue that thinking about decomposition from a post-human environmentalist perspective provides alternative understanding of decomposition that takes its point of departure in trans-species togetherness. In other words, decomposition can be understood as a mode of togetherness that transgress the boundaries between life and death, as well as species. As they argue, decomposition involves becoming together in relation, quite literally, as decomposing matter becomes food for other organisms. In the tube, bacteria and mites feed on the rotting matter, which is the inseparable mix of decaying flies and decaying food. In the tube, flies perform cannibalism as they eat their kin's bodily matter, which has become part of the food as it decomposes in it. On the one hand, the queer affiliation of decomposition represents something that is socially constructed as grotesque, such as cannibalism. And the other, this improper affiliation renegotiates the concept of togetherness to possibly include decomposition, rotting, digestion, bacteria, and fungi, queering the very understanding of intimacy. Within the queer ecologies of the tube, and thinking with such improper affiliation of decomposition, one can argue that transgenic fruit flies and their remains are queer figurations that problematize the boundaries between nature and artifact, as well as life and death. These flies are matter out of place that disrupts the sovereign fantasy of purity. They are constituted as hazardous waste because they are technologically made through genetic manipulation and gene transformation that escapes the cherished classificatory systems of inheritability and parental heredity, heterosexual reproduction, and vertical gene transfer. These deviant bodies are also thought of as hazardous because even in death, they are agential and could potentially pass on their genetic material, their infection, their viral companions, and their toxicity. Such queer intimacies work against the idea that novelty comes from within a species and is produced through heteronormative reproduction rather than from interrelationalities between species, through technologically assisted reproduction, symbiosis, and horizontal gene transfer. In other words, the queer element in thinking about transgenic flies and microorganisms in the lab is how gene transfer is dislocated from its heteronormative matrix of reproduction. Horizontal gene transfer between species and asexual reproduction of bacteria and cells are just two of the examples that have been discussed by queer studies and animal studies scholars who argue for the necessity of thinking with interrelationalities in queer ecologies in theorization of nature. And examples, Ramiro Hurd and Morton are some of the scholars, or Malin A. King, another one. On the one hand, queer affiliation as a mixing with the other exposes not only the racist, sexist, Eurocentric, and specious grounds of modern theorization of nature, but also the heterosexist anxieties embedded in it. In other words, it exposes the fact that modern ideals about nature predetermine natural reproduction embedded in a binary gender matrix and penetrative sex as the only way of life, both in the sense of living a life as well as creating life itself. Queer ecologies and queer intimacies of death take their point of departure in symbiosis, transspecies relationality, technologically mediated life and death, which suggests an ethics of relationality over binary hierarchies. As such, and thinking with Mortimer Sandlands and Erickson, a queer ecology of death rethinks ideas and practices of managing nature, waste, and sex/sexuality as they co-produce each other and reimagines the sexual politics of nature as well as the ontologies of biological waste. In other words, it rethinks not only the intersection between nature and sex, but also the intimate relations between the subject and its other in material and discursive ways, so as to develop a sexual politics that takes the natural world and its biosocial construction seriously. To understand humans and non-humans' improper affiliation, which highlights that there is no such thing as pure or natural ecology, To the contrary, ecologies are always already queer, always already multi-species, technologically mediated, humanimal, and socioculturally embedded. What is at stake here is that ecology is understood as a relational becoming of the self, other, and the environment, which is enacted through improper affiliation and beyond heterosexual reproduction or even sexuality in a normative way. This is productive because despite the normative sociocultural assumptions and evolutionary biology that deem queer and non-normative couplings in nature as an evolutionary dead end, to use Ocking's work, queer affiliations are productive of new forms of life and death. So far, I tried to explain my take on the notion of queer ecologies of death within the context of laboratory waste management. And to end this talk, I wish to just a little bit also talk about ecologies of resistance in the lab that comes about when one thinks about biological waste. And here I've had actually, you can see the interview excerpt that I have shared, and I was talking with one of my informants about the dangers of transgenic fruit flies and laboratory waste, and how she was sort of scaling them in a very interesting way to sort of highlight that sometimes the imagined danger is not really a danger. So I asked, can bacteria cause a problem if they get out of the laboratory? And Karin said, well, we often work with E. coli, and we humans already have them in our system. I have a very hard time seeing if they can actually be spread, but yes, it could be. I've not dug into it, but I'm not worried about it. I mean, if you create a super bacteria that can spread fast by the air, and it's super good at spreading and has some super gene that can resist a lot of other stuff, then maybe. So it's a bit of science fiction-y then. Yes, that sounds like science fiction. The bacteria we are working with here are quite harmless. I mean, we are in the lab working with them, and we don't have any masks or particular uniforms. Well, viruses are different. For example, if you are working with an HIV virus and you get a wound in the lab and get the virus into your blood system, that could be dangerous. What do you think about chemical waste? If you get a lot of chemical waste accidentally into the water system, she said, it can poison our drinking water, which is very unlikely, of course, but chemicals that are toxic should not be let out. So you think that it is more risky than bacteria then, I asked. She responded, yes, by far more risky. There are lots of chemicals that can interfere with the DNA. And if you get it in your body, then it interferes with your DNA and can easily cause cancer. So, thinking through my conversation with my informant in the labs I visited, categorization of flies remains as waste often had to do with potential risk to environment or wildlife, but mostly with humans. It was human life that was mostly at stake. As I have argued elsewhere, the hazardousness is a locally specific and relational phenomenon that is enacting and embedded in practices of handling waste. One needs to assess which remains are potentially riskier. For example, chemicals are by far more dangerous than bacteria in the lab. A virus is situated somewhere in the middle. In this context, of course. In other words, the scale of hazardousness is specific to the experiment and the bacteria, viruses, and chemicals that are moved around, produced, and handled as waste in a particular laboratory. And it can change once the material, experiments, and species change. The hazardousness is also defined in relation to local environments. For instance, Karin argued that 80 flies or Alzheimer's flies in her lab, or pretty much transgenic fruit flies, are not a danger to the natural ecology in Sweden because of the harsh climates. She said that even if they get outside the lab, they will die before they can leave a material mark on nature and create an environmental crisis. Nonetheless, and despite the fact that Karin does not consider flies to be dangerous, materially speaking, these flies ended up in a waste bin that was labeled as hazardous waste. So even though they end up in biohazard waste bin, but they were not exactly treated as such. According to the laboratory guidelines, the hazardous bio-waste had to be autoclaved or frozen immediately. However, in Karin's lab, scientists would leave the flies' remains piling up in a waste bin for days before transferring them to a storage unit to be collected by the local waste company. Similarly, in Helene's lab, which was my other informant, the flies were not considered hazardous. However, unlike Karin's lab, the disposal practices of flies remains in Helene's lab followed the guidelines. Namely, in Helene's lab, the flies were autoclaved immediately. The difference here is not about one lab taking less responsibility or the other following the regulations. Rather, the difference in waste management practices between the two labs is due to the ambiguity of the flies as waste. As I mentioned earlier, living and dead flies are mixed in the tubes, which defies the waste guidelines and the main principle that assumes the biowaste to be a dead organism. Furthermore, the guidelines are based on the general principle that the remains are hazardous should they escape the laboratory space, particularly. Flies are not particularly dangerous as such. Such material specificities of flies as biowaste leave room for interpretation and local decision-making about waste management. While Helene's lab has an autoclave machine, they use the same standard regulation of handling flies as they use for handling other organisms, which are actually indeed dangerous, according to her. Karin's lab, on the other hand, lacks an autoclave machine, and it takes time and effort for the technician to run across the building several times a day while working with them, specifically that they don't pose any danger. Nonetheless, even though the flies in Karin's lab are not handled according to the guidelines for biowaste, they are still stored in a waste bin that is labeled hazardous biowaste, embodying a warning that Helene once proffered jokingly to me about different experiments. Oh, you don't want these organisms to get out of the lab. So it can be argued that these remains perform a queer ecology of resistance as they embody an in-betweenness between life and death, hazardous and safe, natural and artificial, and an ambiguity that make it difficult for the practitioner to determine their specificities as waste. On the one hand, these flies are genetically manipulated and embody toxic proteins. On the other hand, they do not expose a material threat to the natural ecology should they get out of the lab. Their ambiguity shape not only different categorization of waste, but also different practices of handling waste that resist and evade a clear-cut guidelines of laboratory waste management and policing efforts aimed to control the flow of dead matter. And here is the list of references, and thank you for listening. I hope that I didn't take too much time.
Thank you, Dr. Mehrabi. That was very stimulating, and I'm going to have to go back and listen to the recording because my hand is sore from taking notes. So thank you. We have a few minutes or some minutes left in our session today. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. I know it's a lot to absorb, but I do welcome any questions that folks or thoughts that folks might have. I guess one of the things, Dr. Mehrabi, that I'll ask you as maybe people are thinking of their own questions, and this might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but I was interested in that last part around the queer or the ecologies of resistance and kind of the bacteria virus, and then thinking about COVID now being understood as airborne. How could we use this idea of queer ecologies of death to think about the coronavirus? Yeah, I mean, I'm really taken by your framing of queer ecology as like troubling the binary between life and death and renegotiating
Mm.
another form of togetherness. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how the concept of a queer ecology of death might help us to think um, about the coronavirus.
Mm. I think that's actually thank you for the question. I think that's a very interesting question. And I know that there has been a lot of discussion within posthumanities as well, reflecting on coronavirus and how sort of it pretty much um, mess with a lot of boundaries in borders, bodies, like different relations. It pretty much sort of crossed all the boundaries behind this idea of control over, everything. And in that way, there is a lot of discussion that it's exactly like the moment to think about how these boundaries are arbitrary and how sort of like thinking with virus can kind of brings that to light, that no matter where we are, how science is developed, etc., things can happen because nature has its own agency and beyond human control. At the same time, there have been also a lot of critique towards this approach that while the toll of the COVID situation has been distributed unequally across, again, different kinds of social categories and geographies around the world. So this might not be a very responsible way of thinking with COVID, which is also, I mean, kind of, a valid point. Then at the same time, again, to think about the COVID politics beyond human centrism sort of makes us, I think about the micropolitics of COVID in a different way. And I've been thinking about, for example, both in terms of the spread of the virus, but also the vaccines and how sort of the whole sort of production of the vaccines and how this immunity is sort of spread around again in populations, sort of like still both bears the very much predominant power relations, but at the same time, make us think differently about. So, I mean, there's a lot of sort of things happening there that I think this sort of post-human approach to thinking with viruses beyond human exceptionalism is actually a potentiality for us to not dismiss questions of power and sociality, but to think about the microbiopolitics embedded in those and beyond human centrism and control, so to speak.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I actually have a question from Mia, who says, thank you for the fascinating talk, still processing. My question is about the Queer Death Studies Network, and this was actually a question I had as well. So can you tell us more about how this network came to be and what future activities or opportunities is the network creating?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. We actually, the whole network started in 2016, and pretty much a bunch of us were sort of working with death in a very non-normative ways. I mean, so to speak, like from different approaches. Some actually very much closely engaging queer and trans studies and sort of coming from activism, others sort of having using the notion a little bit more loosely, which again, we also have received critiques for it, and I'm aware of what we're doing here, but I still feel like there are potentiality in expanding the notion of or like the concept of queering beyond its connections to queer activism, because it has a lot of potential in it. Anyway, so we started there as 6 of us. We started this network, and from there we sort of had 3 international workshops that was very well perceived. So we thought, oh, maybe there is something here. So we're going to take it further and establish a network. And the network is open to public, both on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and there's also a website which I shared in my PowerPoint slides. And we have a variety of people within the network that sort of deal with questions of death, dying, and mourning beyond the normative approaches, and from a post-human, decolonial, and queer trans perspectives. And we are academics, we have artists, we have activists. So it's kind of like a network that is initiating conversation about death, dying, and mourning across boundaries, across disciplines, and beyond the normative. At the moment, we are putting together the first handbook of curated studies. We have had 2 special issues, one published on KKF is women, the English, gender and women's studies. It's a Danish journal. That's why I'm sort of like in my head trying to translate. And one in Australian Feminist Studies Journal as well. And we had one international conference that was very well received, and we were so excited about it in Karlstad in 2019. And we are hoping to apply for funding for the network, to have a second one in the future. But aside from the handbook, at this moment, there's not any particular event happening, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So I see some people are leaving, and it's also just the time in terms of classes starting. So I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So I think we'll end it here. So thank you so much, Dr. Mehrabi, for that absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you to everyone who attended, and just a friendly reminder of our next event on January 25th. So take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.